Hi, thank you everyone and welcome, and thank you for having me. So my name is Esenia Cassidy and I'm interdisciplinary psychedelic researcher. I'm also a co-founder of the Psychedelic Humanities Lab at the New School for Social Research with Dr. Nicholas Langlitz. My training so far has been in psychology, problematic substance use, counseling, and harm reduction. And currently, as Marcus mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the Ohio State University College of Social Work in Columbus, Ohio. Relatedly, my research interests currently focus on the intersections of psychedelics, trauma, gender, attachment, and addiction, to name the main salient points. Here to issue, I'm an active member of the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education, under the guidance of Dr. Alan Davis, more on whom in a second. And I work on projects here that involve gender identity in relation to psychedelic use and passionate attachment to substances, which we'll also unpack later today. My other affiliations include the Sex Tech Lab at the New School for Social Research with Dr. Pante Farvid, and also Per Granqvist Attachment and Psychedelics Lab at Stockholm University. My interdisciplinary approach is rooted in my commitment to addressing complex societal issues through innovative research and clinical practice. Hold on, just check that the slides are progressing. Yeah, okay, good. This is the tentative structure of my presentation today. So we're going to do a brief introduction, then we're going to discuss the context in which, in which attachment theory was created. And there's a lot of context, some of which is the, I think, dichotomy of relationality and cognitive focus that Marcus briefly mentioned. So I was very happy. It's a good segue to that part. Then we'll discuss current researchers who are focused on attachment and psychedelics to some degree. And then later we discuss in the section New Frontiers work that involves attachment, psychedelic research work that involves attachment on some level without it being focused, but it kind of indicates promising future directions. I'm sure some of which will be taken and expanded on by future researchers. So I was born on the Pacific island of Sakhalin. It seems important. Personal narrative seems important to incorporate. That's the island. The island has a history of colonization, a history of a military conflict with Japan, a history of being a notorious penal colony for two worst kinds of criminals in the Tsar Russia, which is political prisoners, political dissidents, and serial murderers. So these two types of prisoners were sent there for many years. And more recently, the island of Sakhalin, my home island, has it features mixed Korean and Russian population. So these two cultures, Korean and Russian, kind of assimilated into each other to various degrees. And that combination of synergy rather is present in the day-to-day life of the island. As a young adult, I was involved in nonprofit work, specifically related to environmental issues. Here with Greenpeace, as you can see, also harm reduction and human rights. And over the course of my life, I've started various campaigns, started and spearheaded various campaigns and nonprofit organizations related to these issues. I then had a career, essentially most of my life before pivoting back into psychology. I had a career in media, journalism, and I've done some work in documentary filmmaking, and right before I went back to school to go into psychology, I associate produced this documentary, which was shortlisted for Academy Awards, got a lot of publicity, a lot of awards at other festivals, Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer. Also, during my career in media, I've interviewed, one of the things I was writing about was film, so I've interviewed a great deal of film directors, actors, local and international. That's something I did right before pivoting into what we're going to talk about. And so, as strange as it may sound, I think all of this diverse work and background came to the point of singularity, in a sense, for me, with my dive into psychedelic research around 2019. And to discuss my epistemologies, my approaches on 2019 with co-writing this article, which came out in 2020. my epistemologies are constructivist, critical, and phenomenological. To clarify this, and this is the an attempt at a kind depiction of my research lineages. And by the way, Henry and Marcus, I just noticed that if you have something to tell me, just maybe speak, because I actually don't see the chat. I don't monitor the chat, just so we're on the same page. So these are my research lineages, and in purple you see my immediate current inspirations, mentors, and colleagues. Some of which I will mention today. And so in blue, you see their inspirations and mentors and colleagues. And then the green is like the third layer, which I don't have for some of them. But for example, it's Michel Foucault for Paul Rabinov, who was Nicholas Langlitz's mentor and inspiration, and Stanislav Grof for Mithofer's, who are an inspiration for Christopher, and so on. And also I directly learned from Mithofer's too, so I consider them direct inspirations for me too, but I didn't want to make the structure too complicated. So I hope this makes sense. And as always, with any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And so I have been interested in the role of attachment and early life interactions with caregivers for mental and physical health for about a decade. In New York City, where I lived before moving to Columbus, Ohio for the PhD program, I had a Dharma teacher named Josh Korda at a group called Dharma Punks NYC. And Josh was practicing and teaching something called Neurodharma, which is he discussed Buddhist phenomenology and Buddhist processes through the lens of neuroscience and vice versa, which is a really captivating way to discuss something like this, it seemed to me. So I was really enthralled with his presentations and talks and guided meditations weekly. And he heavily incorporated attachment theory into his work, which was my first in-depth exposure to it. And my sort of research focused on psychedelics, first in relation to problematic substance use, which was my first original training, again, after the media and all that. And more recently, my research focus on psychedelics is related to attachment as predictor, outcome, and process level mechanism for psychedelic use and psychedelic assisted psychotherapies in general. For example, my recent study of childhood trauma, challenging ayahuasca experiences, and post-traumatic growth tapped not into attachment directly, but into that associated phenomena, looking into childhood traumatic experiences, in a sense, as a proxy for attachment adversity, because attachment adversity is definitely one of the types of adverse and traumatic childhood experiences. I also have written on the role of attachment in enculturation and cultural transformation during acute psychedelic effects. And I guess before we really delve into the kind of meat of the presentation, I just wanted to share a quick personal anecdote. So I went back to school after like all these different careers. I went back to school in 2018 at the New School for Social Research in New York. And around, I think, 2020, 21, I was enrolled into labs there, the attachment lab, a big attachment research center, and a psychopathology lab. And I was just beginning to kind of work with psychedelics through the psychopathology lab. We were just actually co-writing this very article. So I must have been 2019. And I already saw that there was a potential in looking into through the research lens at attachment and psychedelics. And I essentially contacted the head of the attachment lab, which was, again, big established center. And I said, hey, I feel like there's a lot of potential. Why don't we do something which would allow us to look into attachment psychedelics through research lens? It seems very promising. And I think it was still fringe for, at least for that audience at that point, because the attachment lab director quickly got back to me and said, no, why don't you do it with the other lab? And I think for me, it was in a sense a pivotal point of how I was like, okay, if the attachment research doesn't seem excited or even open to bring psychedelics into it, maybe the psychedelic research will be open to bring attachment into it. And well, lo and behold, here we are today with that, realization, that pivot. So before we get into attachment theory, let's unpack where the field of psychology and the related disciplines were at that point in time. Right. So John Bowlby was working and created the theory in 50s, 60s. I think the first article he published on the topic was actually in 1940, still while still in his training, which then resulted in his famous trilogy on attachment, published in 1969. But so the time we're talking about is 50s, 60s. In developmental psychology, Jean Piaget was very prominent at that time with his focus on child's cognitive development, the developmental stages. As you may recall, in medicine, there were advances in antibiotics, vaccines, and growing emphasis on public health, all of which improved children's survival rate dramatically. Psychosomatic medicine was developing, which explored the links between psychological and physical health. In sociology, the focus was expanding onto family dynamics, socialization processes, and the structural aspects of society that affect individuals' behavior. I guess we can see how all of these kind of structures forming this scaffolding for the creation of attachment theory. Theories focusing on the function of family structures and the impact of social change on individual behavior were prominent in accordance with what was happening in sociology as well. And all of this seems very in line with Bowlby's thinking about these matters in a kind of interdisciplinary, intertwined way, while emphasizing the dyadic dynamic in the child-caregiver interactions and their link to broader social patterns, right? Kind of zoom out. Altogether, this context may, and I'm sure have influenced Bowlby and his views on the importance of caregiver relationships in the emotional and physical health of children. And I guess we can say that all in all, there was a lot of shifting, kind of not just in science and research, as we know, but in a wider kind of politically, societally, those were the times of shifts and changes. And I think that kind of provides a better big view picture of the context in which the theory was created. But the field of psychology, as we may remember, was dominated by behaviorism then, and especially in the United States, which focused on observable behaviors and dismissed any kind of internal experiences, right? Like emotions, thoughts, feelings, and psychoanalysis, as we know, was in full bloom and very, very big, with focus on the unconscious and early childhood experiences, but in a different way from Bowlby. And there's also an interesting interpersonal aspect of Bowlby's relationships with the rest of the psychoanalysts at that time. So as we know, Bowlby's initial training was in child psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and that he was doing in 1930s and 40s, and he was an active member of the British Psychoanalytical Society. This is their website currently. He was trained in psychoanalysis by Melanie Klein, a prominent figure in psychology in general and psychoanalysis in particular. And he knew Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, who took further and expanded on her father's work. And here is the picture of Melanie Klein, center left, and Anna Freud, center right, holding a kitten with other members of the British Psychoanalytical Society. So it gives you a sense of what kind of people they were, relatable. However, around the time Bowlby began to work on attachment theory, and that's not a picture at that time, that's a picture of his later, I just thought it's a very nice picture. He looked differently when he was working on the theory. So his views started to divert from the psychoanalytical framework. And he attempted to, as Per Granqvist, one of my mentors, worded it, to do a reformation from within. So Bowlby, as we know, utilized ethology, which is behavioral biology, cybernetics to a degree, cognitive science, and moved in directions of kind of engineering principles, so to speak, that direction was rather off-putting for his psychoanalyst peers. And essentially, they stopped calling him to meetings. Like, they didn't formally exclude him at that point, but he was still paying his dues. But they stopped calling him to the meetings. Which I guess we can unpack from attachment viewpoint sometime. And so I guess a quick recap. So this is a picture. This is not the society, but this is, of course, prominent figure. This is Freud, and top right is the person, Ernest Jones, I think, who started the British Psychoanalytical Society and was the kind of main prominent English-speaking psychoanalyst and popularizator of psychoanalysis in English, essentially. And so a quick recap of how exactly Bowlby deviated from the psychoanalytical framework, not in the view of that time psychoanalysts, but I think more balanced, kind of based on our current understanding. What was the nature of those discrepancies, right? As we know, traditional psychoanalysis emphasized the role of drives and fantasies, while Bowlby focused on real-life observable behavior, operational word being observable behavior, events, and relationships, particularly the child's actual experiences with caregivers. He argued that these real-life actual interactions were more critical to development than the interpretation of real life through fantasies and dreams, which was the focus of psychoanalysis. Bowlby incorporated empirical research into his work, which was in contrast with the traditional psychoanalytic reliance on clinical observation and case studies. If you remember, early psychoanalytical publications would be all individual case studies, which then would be kind of generalized very non-discriminatorily onto the rest of the population, which is a questionable practice, but we're not going to go into that now, just to emphasize some differences. Bowlby used data from naturalistic and cross-species studies, particularly his collaboration with Mary Ainsworth, who worked in Uganda while developing the strange situation procedure, which we discuss in a little bit later. And this was viewed, this sort of very naturalistic and cross-species, very hands-on approach, very empirical approach, was viewed by some psychoanalysts as deviating and moving away from the method. I guess he also criticized the psychoanalytic theories of the time as lacking a consistent scientific basis, especially concepts like drive theory. And he's not the only one who criticized those, of course, which were not sort of observable enough to him or even biological principles. I think that's some of the basis of criticism. And I think main concern on their part, and the psychoanalyst's part, was that he was too focused on ethology, on biological mechanistic principles, and they felt it was done at the expense of the dynamic unconscious that was so very dear, of course, to their practice. And they kind of like saw it as Bowlby almost dismissing and not holding it as important as it should be. One more aspect of discrepancy was that traditional psychoanalysis thought that child's dependency needs, the emotional connection, wanted to be close, they viewed at that point as something that needed to be carefully managed, and child needed to be kind of distanced and being able to be self-sufficient and manage their own feelings by themselves, and so those connections and dependencies almost seemed not necessarily pathological, but something not to give into and kind of trying to work with, trying to manage. While Bowlby saw secure dependency in early life, secure kind of normal, healthy developmental dependency in early life as foundational to fostering future independence, functioning, and self-sufficiency. And so if we see, if you look at it, it's kind of on the one hand, Bowlby integrated both approaches because we could see interest to early life experiences, right, which is part of psychoanalysis, but different type of early life experiences, and focus on observable and, empirical. So we could see kind of like the traces of both of those approaches, yet none of them were actually ultimately happy with what Bowlby created, and psychoanalysts were particularly unhappy. And while the evolutionary aspect of attachment can be traced back to behaviorism, his theory was a departure from purely cognitive and purely externally oriented views. And the sort of reconciliation towards the kind of like later, towards the end of his life, was largely due to the efforts of Mary Main on the left, who is Per Grönqvist's actually mentor. Mary just passed 2 years ago in January, and Peter Fonagy on the right, to examine the intersection of attachment theory and psychoanalysis. And specifically, Mary Main worked with representational measures such as the adult attachment interview. It's a very robust, very structured tool, a qualitative tool for investigating people's attachment. And it's essentially it resembles the structure of psychoanalytical clinical conversations. It's kind of like as psychoanalytical as it gets in the current applications of attachment theory. And that sort of helped kind of like bridge this gap and kind of like bring the attachment theory back under the umbrella of psychodynamic theories. And I think now people just people assume that attachment theory just kind of by default is part of the psychodynamic cluster of approaches. And I think to some extent this is true because attachment theory is an object relational theory, but it's also very unique considering the role of cognitive and mechanistic principles. And also since attachment theory borrows from cognitive psychology and behavioral principles, in theory, you could argue that the CBT community, for example, could have been claiming that attachment theory is just as much their child as it is for the psychodynamic group. But I feel like in a sense, almost like neither of the groups takes a full ownership of this. And it's, I think it's a little bit viewed as this like problematic child, which is, and almost often I think it's viewed by the particularly CBT and cognitive practitioners as something very psychoanalytical and neo-Freudian, the attachment theory. And it's ironic considering the dynamic between the psychoanalysts of the time and Bowlby for a lot of his life. And however, we can confidently say that Bowlby's work profoundly influenced both psychoanalysts and broader psychological theory, leading to new directions in understanding of child development and mental health. So I want to see if there are any, like a couple of burning questions we can take if we have them, and then if not, we can proceed.
I don't think we have any questions regarding this part of the presentation.
Yeah, I got this one. Yeah, but it's a different one. Okay, I'm happy to proceed. Thank you, Marcus. Let me just close this. Thank you. And so with that helpful, hopefully, context, we arrive to the attachment theory itself. And I just want to say that this section is informed by Bowlby's work, but also by the work of attachment researchers since then. So this is a more sort of updated, balanced view and provides the few main kind of like cornerstones and tenets of the theory, hopefully well balanced with the rest of this talk, so we can have a chance and a time to cover the rest of the topics, because each of these subtopics is very, very interesting, and I'm sure we can spend hours discussing and arguing about them. So yeah, I hope we can save that for the discussion section. And so to reiterate, attachment theory was created by John Bowlby in the 50s and 60s, and it postulates that infants are inherently motivated to form strong affectional bonds or attachments with their caregivers. Those early life interactions with primary caregivers define crucial lifelong outcomes, including mental, physical health, social connectedness, overall well-being, and a host of other outcomes. These attachments are crucial for child's physical safety and emotional well-being, especially in adverse situations, providing a child with the safety and security in the immediate presence of the expectedly responsive and reliable caregiver or attachment figure. Bowlby proposed that children develop a set of internal representations of working models. They often referred to as internal working models, IWMs, of the relationships with the attachment figures, which then influences the child's self-worth and expectations in all future relationships, not just romantic ones. And these models encompass foundational beliefs, and we unpack a little bit more in a second, and they can are like these priors that person utilizes without most often without being aware of it, yet they factor into pretty much any interaction and any relationship the person has for the rest of their lives, guiding their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and so on. That was not the right slide. I'm having a bit of a technical issue. No, I think we're good. We are back. and we are good. Let me just catch up with where we go. And yeah, so as Bowlby believed that these attachment priors were active from the cradle to the grave, so through the entire lifespan of an individual, including affecting their romantic relationships too, but also non-romantic relationships later in life, throughout their entire life. We can find attachment themes in culture, religion, and spirituality. And some researchers, again, Per Granqvist, a very good prominent example of that. If you're not familiar with his work, I highly recommend it. He's written a great book on attachment in religion and spirituality. And he specifically explored how people relate to entities like God, for example, and found that attachment patterns are very, very active and very prominent and factor importantly into those interactions, which also means that people can derive some kind of compensatory secure attachment from those interactions. But I'll leave it there. I highly recommend Per Granqvist's work. Check it out. One of the key, most cornerstone concepts of attachment theory is attachment orientations, often referred to as styles. And they could be measured on the axis of attachment avoidance and anxiety, as we can see on this simple structure. And therefore, attachment orientations low on both. So top left. So low on anxiety, low on avoidance, secure. Essentially everything else, all other three options, are different types of insecure attachment, with high anxiety, low avoidance being preoccupied, anxious, low anxiety, high avoidance being avoidant, resistant, and high on both anxiety and avoidance being disorganized, or fearful, or unresolved. There's different terminology, but it's the same. They map onto each other pretty well. Just different schools of thought at different times used different words to name the same phenomena, and also it differs between attachment research in children and early life interaction-oriented attachment research and attachment research in adults and of adult romantic relationships. The terminology is slightly different. Yet again, however, it refers to same four attachment orientations. And so insecure attachment, and when we say insecure attachment, it's either three of the ones that are not the secure one, right? So at large, insecure attachment is associated with a host of adverse mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety, problematic substance use, high stress, and there are individual differences of the said orientations. As an extension to Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, who worked with Bowlby and then continued this work, and colleagues discovered systematic variations in how infants organize their attachment. And it was their work, so Ainsworth and colleagues were distinguished the first three types: secure, insecure, avoidant. Here is labeled as avoidant. Insecure, anxious, or resistant. Here labeled as preoccupied. Secure attachment is believed to be the primary strategy an infant resorts to when it's seeking, proximity, support, comfort, food, safety, any of those things. And as newborns do, this signaling happens. Primary signaling is crying and trying to get the caregiver's attention. And at the representational level, which this is really intriguing to me, I hope it is well known, but I would like it to be even better known. At the representational level, these children, securely attached children, see themselves as worthy of care. They see the other or the others as reliable and attuned and responsive. And they see the world as essentially benevolent and kind of by default. Like that's the setting they get with secure attachment. And if the primary secure strategy fails for whatever reason, the secondary strategy emerges, which is insecure attachment. And it could manifest in different ways. But overall insecurity is characterized by attentional and behavioral rigidities and kind of like caveats of behavior. when the child either minimizes attachment behavior, which is avoidance, or maximizes attachment behavior, which is anxiety, resistance, preoccupation. Such children, again, based on experiential research and experiential feedback, have a view of themselves as not worthy of care, the view of the other or the others as unreliable, unresponsive, inconsistent, and the view of the world as not so benevolent place and not so kind or reliable. The fourth category, disorganized or disoriented attachment, here marked right down corner as fearful, was created by Mary May and colleagues kind of as an extension of the original categories. And it's kind of most associated with heavily inconsistent or highly abusive or a combination of those type of caregiving, and is very predictive of highly unfavorable socioeconomic development and other outcomes, again, mental health, physical health, depression, anxiety, stress, problematic substance use. There is a lot of literature on these topics, so it's a very robust host of negative outcomes. I'm sorry, I have again a slight technical issue with kind of being able to move my cursor, but I think it's good at this point. So adolescents and adults also form, as we briefly mentioned, attachment relationships later in life with their romantic partners. And so that's the two main strains of attachment research. One is focused on early life interactions with caregivers, the other one on the romantic later in life romantic attachments. And while these two strains differ, they again use, like I mentioned, the same map. They just call those attachment styles or orientations differently. And I will also say attachment styles is used more in those romantic relationship research, where attachment orientations more in the kind of Bowlbian style early life interactions with caregivers contexts. And if you look at unresolved disorganized attachment, an interesting caveat is that it is associated with high proclivity for mystical type experiences, not just in psychedelic contexts. And this is Per Granquist writes a lot about this, and this link is statistically mediated by dissociation. So, so unresolved disorganized attachment is associated with more dissociation, which then in turn allows higher capacity for mystical experiences. I think it's a helpful kind of leading up to the psychedelic topic in a second. And also associated with suggestibility, which kind of clear how it factors into this, because higher suggestibility, then higher propensity, higher dissociation, all of this kind of makes sense if you think about it experientially. And two more important concepts of attachment theory to touch on before we move forward is epistemic trust and epistemic vigilance. Epistemic trust was introduced by Peter Fonagy and colleagues. And it may act as a psychological mechanism explaining why secure attachment enhances social learning and enculturation. So the way it works is that essentially those people we described who have secure attachment, who see the world as reliable, others as benevolent and helpful, they are open to the information from the outside. And therefore, one of the things it means is that they can engage in social learning and as a result, fit better within society, be more successful socially. And now all that is associated with attachment. While the related concept, epistemic vigilance, introduced by Sperber and colleagues in 2010, it's not just lack of the opposite of epistemic trust. Epistemic vigilance is almost like a capacity for critical thinking, essentially, and is also associated with attachment security, because in experiments, more securely attached children demonstrated higher epistemic vigilance, which means that even the information coming from their trusted caregivers, they take with a grain of salt, and they can discern if it's not trustful or it doesn't check out for some reason this information. So, and I think what it goes to say is that both epistemic trust and epistemic vigilance are necessary to successful functioning in society. And kind of there should be enough of each, because if someone is highly epistemically vigilant, it means they are completely closed off to any external information. They have a hard time relating to people or receiving any social learning, which could lead to difficulties in socialization. While, of course, if they have too much epistemic trust, it means they do not have enough critical thinking, and it could also have its negative consequences. So, as with everything, the balance is important, and both of these terms, epistemic trust and epistemic vigilance, are associated with attachment orientations. And what's interesting, I think, before we delve into the next topic, is that regardless of their kind of core attachment disposition, people can enter temporarily states associated with other sort of with different attachment security. Experiments were done where people were kind of primed, their security was boosted verbally in some ways, and then the attachment orientations were measured, and people who underwent those boosts in security, who originally had insecure attachment, then exhibited secure attachment for some time and then reverted back to the baseline. Which reminds me of the important topic we're not going to touch upon, which is earned secure attachment. We can try and back a little bit in the discussion, but not in the structure of the talk. Earned secure attachment as a way to change one's attachment in adult life for more secure in a structured work with an attachment-informed psychotherapist. Let me see if there are any other maybe questions. What developmental stages? Well, I can briefly discuss this. Unless Elena, do you wanna ask a question in voice?
Yeah, do you hear me? Hello.
Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, so partially actually answered my question. But are there any like those important developmental stages where the styles of attachment are actually formed the most? So like when like infants and caregiver, then next stage, I don't know, teenage years and so on. So are they exist?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there's not in detail on this in the topic of my presentation today, but essentially the very first interactions an infant experiences in their life, essentially. And I think the focus on the importance of the very first interactions can decreases. So the way I see it is that I think up to maybe 18 months is the most crucial time. And they're still important later, but the older the child grows, the kind of like less you can do, not in a discouraging way, but just to emphasize the importance of very first interactions. I think I don't have a visual for it. I think there should be a visual. I don't know if it's from Bowlby or from someone else who researched that, but there is a more concrete timetable, which I don't have to demonstrate right now, but it's the very first interactions, which kind of brings me back to the topic Henry and I discussed briefly in preparation to this. Why is the fact that the first interactions are so crucial is not publicized enough? I feel like there should be public awareness campaign to emphasize this for individual and kind of public mental health perspective. We can unpack more in the discussion, but I think it's just the understanding, the acute understanding of how important each early life interaction with an infant is might be just like too much for the people and for the society, because the responsibility is enormous. And my speculation is that as a society, we try to suppress that knowing and just do our best, while, again, the implications of those first interactions are just enormous. However, the good news is that as I mentioned briefly, earned attachment earned secure attachment is very much a phenomenon. There is literature on it. There is a big kind of like important volume I can recommend. It's definitely something some psychotherapists do, but they would need to be trained in it properly and understand what it is they're doing. But it's definitely possible. I know people who are able to change their attachment orientations, at least to some degree, as a result of that structured work. So there's hope. I hope that helps. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just thanks. Yeah, those first months are the most important. Yeah, good. If people would understand that.
Yes, 100%. And thank you. At this point, I'm happy to go to the next block. We have a little bit more. So this section is psychedelic and attachment research, and it's focused on work of researchers who kind of put attachment in the, and I see typo, apologies, attachment in the center of their work with psychedelics for one reason or another. As we know, psychedelic-assisted therapies are a novel medical paradigm that entails psychotherapy work with clients undergoing acute effects of psychedelic compounds. Typically, it's non-classical psychedelics such as MDMA or ketamine, or maybe more classical things like psilocybin, DMT, LSD. The dosing sessions are typically preceded by preparatory sessions, followed by integration sessions. The number of each type of sessions varies by the specific protocol at each site. Increased openness and suggestibility associated with psychedelic effects makes the interpersonal dynamic between the client and the therapists, or a participant and the therapists, very salient during those sessions. And this kind of opens a window that, on one hand, the relational adversity potentially, for example, early life attachment adversity, can be revisited and healed or overcome or processed during those sessions. On the other hand, it also means that if the facilitators are not properly trained or something else is in the play, there is a chance of re-traumatization, not only not resolving one's attachment trauma, but also re-traumatization by unskillful or untrained clinicians, or if just the person has a very severe trauma, which needs to be really addressed in a focused, prepared way. And sometimes, as much as assessment is done during enrollment, sometimes the very severe elements of trauma only transpire during the actual dosing session, from what I've witnessed talking to many practitioners. And of course, with this in mind, both the clients and the therapist attachment orientations do factor importantly in the success and outcomes of psychedelic therapy, and also in its dynamics throughout. And this relationship of these factors is very much underexplored, because very few studies looked into relation between psychedelics and attachment in general. And I know of no studies that have looked into attachment and attachment in clients and therapists in the dosing session, and how they affect each other. Yet there are, hold on, I have a bit of a glitch again. Okay, apologies for that. Yeah, there is limited research on this, and the limited so far research shows us that people do have increased security after psychedelic experiences, specifically in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And this is the research we'll unpack right now. And so before we delve into specific studies, I just want to say that, based, again, on limited empirical and kind of a larger body of theoretical research on this, our understanding so far is that attachment may factor into psychedelic experiences and outcomes in a variety of ways, and contribute kind of through different pathways. So on one hand, attachment anxiety can contribute to increased readiness to drug effects, because of increased propensity for mystical type experiences, as we discussed, kind of more insecure attachment, higher propensity for mystical type experiences, dissociation as a mediator, and it's associated with feelings of kind of like being saved or redeemed, with that sort of willingness for something to come and take charge. And the way I think about it is, it's almost like if that kind of like attention bucket wasn't filled early in life, there is a certain maybe vacuum within a person, and they just looking and ready for something, either another person or mystical experience or maybe spiritual revelation to kind of like come and fill that bucket. And I think that is potential putative, completely speculative mechanism of how that higher propensity for mystical type experiences could take place within attachment insecurity and attachment anxiety specifically. On the other hand, attachment avoidance, which is also that attachment insecurity, can hinder openness and kind of preclude the person from fully engaging, from letting go, from kind of like stepping into their psychedelic experiences. And then we look at attachment disorganization, that's already associated with heightened propensity for dissociation, as we discussed. It could mean capacity for more powerful, including healing psychedelic effects. And we know that mystical experiences and psychedelic experiences associated with a higher level of therapeutic effects. So that could be like an interesting, almost like a bright side of attachment disorganization and attachment insecurity at large. While, of course, more severe attachment disorganization may increase proclivity for challenging psychedelic effects, which is also limitedly supported so far in Stoffer et al. Research, which is our next point. And it's associated with both heightened psychopathology and poor therapeutic outcomes. So once again, severe attachment disorganization, harder to fully participate in psychedelic experiences, higher chance of adverse outcomes afterwards. And re-traumatization is also possible. Like if something comes up and it's very, if the therapists were not aware of it and not aware to the actual degree, it could be challenging to properly address that in the session. And therefore, if that's not done, chance of re-traumatization is high. And because of already suggestibility and openness of psychedelic effects, re-traumatization could be sort of more traumatic than if it was in normal non-psychedelic state of mind. While higher attachment security, as expected, may facilitate a calm surrender and kind of like letting go and going with the flow of acute psychedelic effects. And in their pioneering study on psychedelics directly informed by the attachment theory, Stoffer and colleagues found that attachment anxiety was associated with more mystical experiences and attachment avoidance with more challenging experiences. However, a study colleagues and I conducted a few years ago, it was not focused on attachment, but it was focused on challenging childhood experiences or childhood trauma. And you could argue that childhood trauma and attachment adversity have some overlap. It found that people with histories of childhood trauma did not have a higher likelihood of challenging ayahuasca effects during the active stage of the effects. And also in our study, there was no difference in post-traumatic growth. So we looked at challenging ayahuasca experiences and whether people derived post-traumatic growth based on post-traumatic growth inventory, and whether there was a difference between those who had higher challenging childhood traumatic events or not. And there was no difference between people. So like essentially everyone derived the same or not a different level of post-traumatic growth, which is a benefit, which is reassuring, I think. That's hopefully helpful. And I think the finally connecting thread between kind of like more superficial, high-level connecting thread between attachment and psychedelic science is on one hand, we kind of understand the outcomes of attachment insecurity, again, as mentioned, it's depression, anxiety, problematic substance use, high stress, and other phenomena, mental physical health. And if you look at the kind of like list of conditions and diagnoses, psychedelic assisted therapies have been tested and trialed for, largely that list overlaps, which maybe I think is a hint that psychedelics, psychedelic related conditions or conditions psychedelics are found to potentially treat well, and conditions that are associated with attachment insecurity are connected, and perhaps psychedelics are meant, in a sense, to help with that. So actually, I have a quick question before we proceed, and my question is, if anyone willing to share, like at the top of their head, you don't have to, either in voice or in by typing, why do you think there isn't more research on attachment and psychedelics? And if you never thought about it, it's okay too. let's give it, I don't know, 1 minute to see if someone has anything to say. And maybe Marcus, you have thought of this or can think of this now, just for the sake of discussing this.
Yeah, I think this might even relate to a broader kind of intellectual, I guess, background that also occurred to me when you were giving the background on psychoanalysis and how John Bowlby's research and orientation was slightly off balance from the traditional psychoanalytic research. But it is funny to note that even though psychoanalysis and the approach to the human mind was sort of quite strict and not including any of these social relationships, in a sense of this kind of relational perspective, how we relate to other people, except the mother and father figures, obviously, in psychoanalysis. But that turn changed. There was a relational turn in the 1980s or so, also in psychoanalysis. So even though it used to be really kind of an authoritarian approach, and the psychoanalysis was sort of not saying anything in the treatment, but then in the 1980s it changed radically to this kind of relational approach, emphasizing the point that the psychotherapist and the client's real relationship is the thing that's kind of running the thing. So I guess from kind of these mainstream psychological approaches, from that perspective, it's I guess it's due to the background of this kind of cognitive behavioral approach that has dominated the psychedelic research orientation quite a bit as well. So that's at least one of those kind of broad backgrounds, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think someone said legislation, which is Ansi said legislation, which I think also one of the reasons why. And I think for myself, when I think kind of like more narrowed down in the context of the current psychedelic research, say happening for the last decade, right, 2 decades, the third wave of psychedelic research, so-called psychedelic renaissance, focused on mental and physical health, when I ask myself, why do we not have more attachment psychedelic research? I think some of the things as we just discussed, and also I think because almost like attachment is kind of like not as glamorous, if you will, or not as maybe publicity friendly as acute PTSD symptoms or treatment-resistant depression, and things like this. And I think, attachment itself, as discussed, is a bit of a personally, from my background in psychology, even before I got into psychedelic research, I was shocked, and I still am actually shocked, how little attachment theory is utilized in mental health work or in problematic substance use mental health work. And I think there's a constellation. I think, again, that like this higher maybe inability of on a societal level to fully acknowledge the importance of those, early interactions and the the mental and emotional weight and public health weight of those consequences. I think it's very different, many different levels. And I think we can hopefully more unpack them in the discussion, but here we're going to focus on the few researchers that do this work and go over their work in detail. And some of those researchers, so this is our pre-last section. It focuses on a few people who actively and directly incorporate attachment in their work. And the last section, New Frontiers, will deal with people more like tangentially bring it in and like try it out. But it's not a focus of their work, but still nonetheless is important and promising more than anything. So with that, let's dive into this section. So this is the Christopher's article. Christopher is a researcher and clinician based currently in Portland, Oregon. And I think at that point they were at UCSF still, and that's the UCSF team. They wrote an article titled Psilocybin-Assisted Group Therapy and Attachment, Observed Reduction in Attachment Anxiety and Influences of Attachment Insecurity and Psilocybin Experience. This foundational study was published in 2022, and to my knowledge, is the first academic peer-reviewed article looking into psychedelics and attachment in a, again, concrete, direct way. And attachment is in Bowlbian sense here. And the context specifically is the context of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. And just to, I think, this applies to all of my presentation. The work here, the findings I have is based on my own research and search and investigation, and any tools are imperfect. So I'm sure maybe some articles, some researchers who do aligned work have not kind of been sifted by my research filters. So if anyone is aware of any other researchers that do psychedelic and attachment work that won't be touched upon during the course of this presentation, please feel free to, I actually ask you, please do let me know, because I would like to have a fuller database, which I plan to make publicly available of all this type of research, so I could have a better version of it. Please do share if there is something you feel like is relevant and I haven't mentioned it by the end of the presentation. So this team here, Stoffer and colleagues team, looked into psilocybin-associated changes on the two attachment dimensions we discussed, and investigated attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance as predictors of short-term group psilocybin-assisted therapies outcomes. And I think the fact that it's a group setting is also very unique, because there is, again, not that much research done even without attachment in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in group setting. So this theme's work is novel and innovative in many ways. And so in their results, attachment anxiety decreased significantly between baseline and 3 months follow-up. And attachment avoidance did not change significantly, while attachment anxiety at baseline was strongly correlated with mystical experience, and avoidance at baseline was strongly correlated with challenging experiences during acute psilocybin effects. These are the findings to recap and to make it visual. And these findings are important for the general field of psychedelic mental health research, and also for the subfield of attachment and psychedelic research. And to summarize clinical implications, it essentially means that individual attachment anxiety and avoidance were found to influence the quality and the outcome of their experiences. And higher level of mystical type experiences. As we know, mystical type experiences are associated with higher benefit of psychedelic therapy. So we could trace kind of like direct benefit of that. And I suppose it essentially clinically implies that for people with not secure attachment or less secure attachment, psychedelics could be helpful to increase security of that attachment. That's kind of like very kind of basic, high-level clinical implication. I guess what is important is that one other important aspect is that Christopher and their team pay focused attention and are highly intentional in whom they recruit, how they recruit. They do focus groups to, get people on board early and better, to have more diverse cohorts than anyone else I know. And specifically in this case, all participants, 18 people, were older, male, gay, identified long-term AIDS survivors from Bay Area with moderate to severe demoralization and high trauma exposure. That's a very unique cohort. And more than this, more recent group of their clinical trial in Portland feature a fully transgender and non-binary veteran cohort, which again is very unique and innovative. The team also strives to provide a therapist match for trial participants' unique intersectional identities. For example, if they have a queer, BIPOC veteran participant, they would do their best to provide a queer, BIPOC veteran therapist, trained therapist, which again is absolutely unique, very appreciated, and needs to be done more. And I think this team is a great example of demonstrating such approaches and such thoughtfulness and level of detail. And of course, populations like this, as I mentioned, demoralized long-term AIDS survivors, older, gay, male, in Bay Area, it's a very unique, very specific population. So on one hand, this study provides us with information on such unique, very under-researched populations. On the other hand, of course, it makes these studies' outcomes less generalizable to the general population, just because of multiple, inclusion-exclusion criteria that make this cohort very different from the rest of general population. Another researcher for whom attachment is an important focus is Aaron Cherniak, who is a PhD student of Dr. Per Granqvist at Stockholm University. Cherniak authored 3 papers, or 2 papers and 1 chapter, focused on attachment and psychedelic research, again, directly focused on attachment psychedelic research. And we'll go over them chronologically, briefly. His earliest theoretical paper, published in 2022, was titled Psychedelic Science of Spirituality and Religion, an Attachment-Formed Agenda Proposal. And that's the whole team of the Stockholm University lab, and also some other folks, as you can see. This article is novel and important for our subfield of attachment psychedelic research, because I think it serves as a theoretical. So if this Stoffer et al. Article was first empirical, groundbreaking article on these topics, this is I would say, a theoretical counterpart. So a first theoretical, directly relating attachment psychedelics article. So I can think of them as this first and second working together in tandem, being first in each own subdomain and supporting each other. Cherniak here expands on Per Granqvist's work, and also heavily relies on Chris Stoffer's work, empirical work, and claim that attachment works as a predictor, outcome, and process level mechanism during psychedelic experiences. So what does it mean? It means that attachment factors into how the psychedelic experience is going to go. At the same time, attachment can be, and as we demonstrated, can be changed as a result of the psychedelic experience. This is the psychedelic experience. And also, while this process is happening, attachment factors into each facet of the interactions during the psychedelic experience. Therefore, it's this trifecta of impact. I think someone needs to make a kind of visualization of this, because I would like to see that. And this article also sets an agenda for psychedelic science of spirituality and religion based on attachment theory. And I think to recap, they outline 3 key proposals for future research in this, again, groundbreaking article. One is that individual differences in attachment theory predict the phenomenology and integration of psychedelic events. Secondly, when it goes right in good environment, psychedelic-assisted therapy can facilitate increased attachment security as one of its outcomes. And 3, that attachment-related dynamics, sense of connectedness to God, others, how benevolent the world is, and so on, involve what's happening in the room and factor into the outcome and takeaways from psychedelic therapy. Chernek's next relevant paper came early in 2024 and is titled Perceive Attachment History Predicts Psychedelic Experiences and Naturalistic Study. This is an empirical article, and 185 people participated in it who identify as Jewish and have used psychedelics. And it so essentially found that it's the perception of one's attachment history and relation with their parents or caregivers rather than like actual events that were associated with psychedelic phenomenology. And so perceiving one's relationship with their parents growing up as more insecure was associated with higher and more intense psychedelic phenomenology, again, mystical experiences and challenging experiences both. Important limitation is that it's a retrospective online survey, which was, covered vast variety of psychedelic compounds taken at different times. So that's a stated disadvantage, but it's discussed in the article, and the findings are really interesting. And again, it's the under-research. It's another example of an under-researched population with high exposure to trauma, because we know from the research of Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who is prominent in the world of trauma and epigenetic trauma specifically, that descendants of Holocaust survivors have higher epigenetic load of trauma, and that's the population of the study on which Aaron Chernek focused, which again makes it, similarly to Christopher's work, very unique and gives us information about the population we don't have much information about, but also makes it less generalizable. And the third work in this topic by the same team came in December last year, so very recently, and is titled Synthesizing Attachment Theory with the Rebus Model, an agenda proposal for psychedelic science. It's a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Psychedelic Religious Spiritual Mystical Experiences. And in this chapter, the authors synthesize the relational developmental perspective on one hand with Robin Carhart Harris's Rebus perspective, and argue that such synthesis can be a fitting organizing framework for psychedelic sciences going forward. And similarly to their earlier theoretical paper, they tie the internal working models from Bowlby and psychedelic-induced neuroplasticity, therefore arguing that neuroplasticity induced during psychedelic effects and shortly after can help revisit the early life traumatic and unresolved situations and facilitate increased attachment security. So that's the short list of the researchers I'm aware of who are focused on attachment psychedelics currently, and not in tangential ways. There is also some emerging researchers who have presented on these topics and are in the process of publishing, because as we know, publishing takes time. So I'm aware of Gustav Martling's work and myself, and we both affiliated with Per Granqvist's lab when it comes to the attachment research lineage. And Per Granqvist is a student of Mary Main. There are also very early career researchers whom I'm aware of, because I can keep an eye on this, and I talk to emerging researchers, and there are people who have some ideas how to take this further, and some of them are currently maybe formulating their grant proposals or just getting exposed enough to research to be able to do this work. It's just we don't know the names yet, and they haven't published yet, but it's happening, it's brewing, hopefully will be more. I also know that some big psychedelic research centers, at least here in the States, we have a few. And so I know that some of them have collected attachment measures throughout their very famous different research clinical trials over the last decade or so. But I think because, again, it goes back to why there is not so much research on attachment psychedelics, because it's I suppose, less publicity friendly than some other results. So they have the data but haven't written on it yet. But I think some of them are writing on it, which hopefully means that there will be more publications on these topics soon, which can increase and diversify this existing very small body of literature. And before we end this section, actually, I want to say a couple of words about Gustav Martling's work and my work. We presented, I think, both of these findings at ICPR conference last summer. There was a symposium with Per Granqvist, Aaron Chernek, Gustav, and myself. And so Gustav looked into legal psychedelic ritual participants' changes in attachment characteristics and found that there was an increase in self-rated emotion regulations and decrease in self-rated attachment anxiety and avoidance, as expected, based on our understanding and Christopher's work. And both emotional breakthroughs and mystical experiences predicted increases in emotional regulation skills in that cohort. And my most recent empirical study, that again hasn't been published yet, looked into the phenomenon of entity encounters during acute ayahuasca effects and examined parallels in participants' attachment with people in their life and the attachment to entities encountered in ayahuasca experiences. And we found that avoidance in relation to humans, but not anxiety, was significantly correlated with avoidance in relation to entities, and that white participants were lower on avoidance than Black or other. So all of this requires further work and further investigation. So I have an idea. So we have our one last block, which is the New Frontiers. But before that, could we possibly do this song? I have a 3 minutes 14 seconds song that I wrote for you guys. Essentially, it's something I do. I like. For my presentations, I often would maybe ask ChatGPT to write lyrics on the topic of the presentation, and then have a songwriting AI to create a song. In this case, I just used this AI and I gave it prompts. First, can I confirm that we can put this song right now for 3 minutes and 14 seconds with Marcus and Henry? Oh, okay, great. The answer is yes. Yes, in this case, I just gave prompts to the this app or this software called Suno, and I have no affiliation. I just like them, and I give prompts. I think the prompts will attachment, psychedelics, in Finland. I don't remember the exact order. And so this is a song we can listen to right now, and then we come back and close up with our last block and go into discussion. Thank you. If you could share the screen, Henry, that'd be great, because the lyrics, I would like people to see the lyrics and try and maybe count how many times things like attachment, psychedelics, and Finland were mentioned.
Sailed on a ship made of rose and gold, watched as the northern lights unfold, psychedelic dreams in a frosty haze, lost in Finland's endless days. Hold me close in this winterland. Our minds expand, hand in hand, floating through a snowbound sea in a Nordic dream serene. Feel the snowflakes on our tongues. Life is young when we're unsprung. Colors dance in a vibrant show. Attachment to the cosmic flow. Hold me close in this winterland. Our minds expand, hand in hand, floating through a snowbound sea in a Nordic dream serene.
Thank you so much. This was great. I appreciate it. Let me reshare my screen again so we could conclude. Yeah, okay, so last section, New Frontiers. In October, November last year, so very recently, we here at The Ohio State University looked into current literature on psychedelics and attachment. We conducted a study identifying and synthesizing key empirical and theoretical research on attachment and psychedelics. Our specific focus for this study was an epistemologies utilized or not utilized, and limitations, especially the limitations that the researchers themselves included or omitted in their studies. However, this did give us a good opportunity to look into kind of prevalent directions in the body and field of the attachment psychedelic research, and some of which I will share with you now. And this research also includes the Stoffer and Chernak articles, so we won't discuss them again because we already unpacked them, I think, in a great level of detail, feasible for this format. So we identified a total of 21 articles, and the inclusion criteria were to be a primary peer-reviewed article, mention both attachment and psychedelics at least once each, and use attachment in the Bowlbian sense and not in the Buddhist sense of attachment. And attachment, for example, these are the main three criteria. And these are the themes, some of the identified main prominent identified themes. Attachment as predictor and outcome of psychedelic effects, romantic and sexual relationships, trauma and grief, more general clinical implications, expanding attachment psychedelic research into the mystical, such as religion, spirituality, the unconscious, and last but not least, passionate attachment. To extract these themes, we utilized data-driven thematic analysis approach as per Brown and Clark, which is an inductive framework in which themes are derived from the data itself in the absence of pre-existing theoretical constraints, letting the patterns and meanings to emerge directly from the qualitative data set. And the qualitative data set in this case was the text of those 21 articles we retained for the analysis. Our epistemologists here were, again, phenomenological, critical, and constructivist. And what we found out was that when we put those prompts into like big database search, we didn't put any constraints on data publication or the language, yet all of the items found, all the 21 articles included, were published between 2015 and 2024. So we, therefore, the idea was to compare the state of knowledge, like right now, to the state of knowledge before, but since we didn't find anything pre-2015, we couldn't find what epistemologies we used in this research because this research as such didn't exist. But we could kind of extrapolate based on other psychology and substance use research that the typical epistemological approach would be positivist with some constructivism every now and again. Most articles, non-surprisingly, came from weird countries, which is white, industrialized, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. Most articles were associated with more than one country. There's collaborations. Bigger half, so 11 of them were empirical, while 10 being theoretical, which is actually a pretty good balance. And of empirical studies, of 11 empirical studies, 7 were quantitative, 3 mixed method, 1 qualitative. An indication of, crucially for our study goals, indication of epistemology or positionality was present in just 3 articles, indirectly in some way. Only 1 article out of 21 articles stated the epistemological approach directly, which was trans-theoretical. Most common limitations included, sort of typically male, white, young, educated sample, higher income, heterogeneity of study conditions in an individual study, a variety of psychedelics. And in our focus, one of the main limitations was like lack of awareness of own epistemology and positionality as conducting the study. And we're going to briefly go over each theme now, and that's all we have to discuss for the rest. This is attachment as predictor and outcome of psychedelic use is something done by Stoffer and Chernak. We just unpacked in detail. We won't do this now. The second theme was relationality, romantic relationships, and sexual functioning. There were 4 articles altogether. One of them discussed ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for individuals, one for couples. Both of these were theoretical and essentially proposed augmentations to ketamine-assisted protocols based on attachment and trauma-informed approaches. One other article in this cluster looked into psychedelic-induced improvements in sexual functioning and found support for improvement in both. They kind of like pulled data together from a larger naturalistic study and a smaller controlled study and found support for improvement in sexual functioning at the post-psychedelic use in both contexts. So people reported more embodied and satisfactory sexual experiences. They were free from cognitive noise and anxieties. Attachment played a small supportive role in this study, wasn't the center of it, in the sense that authors speculated that some of the positive outcomes could have been due to psychedelic-induced changes in attachment, because depression and sexual dissatisfaction have been linked to attachment insecurity before. So the idea was that, yes, attachment insecurity increases, depression decreases, sexual satisfaction increases, which is a really interesting direction. I'm glad they mentioned that. The next theme was traumatic attachment, trauma, grief, and the grief paper was from Deborah Gonzalez, I think, who I think is speaking here later this year. So you can ask her more. All 4 articles, again, attachment was not a center, but was tangentially, but importantly involved, kind of like here and there to support key arguments, which is why the articles were retained. Some of the themes here were, one article touched upon MDMA-assisted therapy for borderline personality disorder, because the role of attachment structures in borderline is prominent. They discussed utilization of an attachment theory-based concept of internal working models, as we briefly unpacked it already, specifically fostered on, I think that was the Gonzalez article. So utilized internal working models to focus on fostering a secure bond with a person who passed away, to therefore increase the security of the attachment with the person who passed away and help process the grief in this way. But you can ask her more, hopefully, on that. And also they included psychedelic-assisted therapy in clinical work with trauma, traumatic dissociation, traumatic attachment, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex trauma. Next theme was the kind of like calls for expansion of attachment and psychedelic-assisted themes into the realm of religion, spirituality, and the unconscious. And as we know, again, and some of this, I think 2 out of maybe 4 articles. Oh, wait, hold on. I think it's the wrong topic. Yes, it's broader clinical indications. Attachment and religion and spirituality is the next theme. I apologize. Yeah, so with broader clinical implications, we included articles that did utilize attachment in the context of psychedelic-assisted therapy, but they couldn't be kind of like put into any other theme. That's why it's its own theme. And the thinking here was, first article, for example, they looked into existing psychotherapeutic modalities, and they looked into how a psilocybin-assisted therapy process unfolds, and then like tried to map which modality would be best for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, which I think is really thoughtful, really curious approach. And they kind of came with conclusions, which one it is, and with recommendations. One more article looked into psychedelic experiences through this psychoanalytic lens, interestingly intertwining the psychoanalytic theory with a case study of a client who used ketamine therapeutically in a course of long-term psychoanalysis in order to repair attachment wounds, instead of arguing that psychedelics can facilitate reconnection to preverbal states. I think it's a bit of a theme. The psychedelic-induced neuroplasticity can allow us to reconnect with those states, with those experiences, and hopefully achieve some sort of repair and processing and be able to integrate those experiences and move forward. One more article he discussed ethical aspects of psychedelic use, again, emphasizing openness, suggestibility, transference, countertransference, how the therapists need to be on top of that, and citing also the famous sexual abuse case in a context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, in order to kind of warn future clinicians and researchers to avoid those mistakes. The next one is the calls for expansion of attachment psychedelic research into the realm of religion, spirituality, and the unconscious, and that, non-surprisingly, a lot of this comes from the Granquist Lab. There were 3 conceptual articles. I think one is the theoretical article by Cherniak we already discussed. One more article was kind of like intertwining together psychoanalysis and attachment. This focus on how self-narrative, coping, survival, and well-being mechanism are heavily based on attachment. So self-narrative based on attachment, because we discussed the priors, seeing oneself as worthy of care, others as reliable or not. So self-narrative in that sense, heavily based on attachment, how it functions in the parallel states. And between the parallel states, they mentioned dreaming, madness, and acute psychedelic effects as non-ordinary states. And one more article kind of like just mostly focused on religion and spirituality, and touched upon psychedelics lightly as an example of kind of like adjacent to pre-psychedelic mystical, religious, and spiritual experiences, saying that kind of like, why don't we do all this work and research in an integrated way, because there is a lot of parallels. And last but not least theme was passionate attachment to substances. Passionate attachment is a very interesting construct. And so 2 of these 3 articles in this section were first authored by Dr. Alan Davis, who is my advisor, and apparently wrote those articles way before we met each other. And the concept of passion for activity, I'm going to try and briefly present, because I think it's very, very interesting, very uncanny. So it's essentially interpreting an activity or substance almost as it was a relationship. And so it's measuring one's relationship with an activity such as maybe pornography use or substance use, again, on the lenses of, on the axis of attachment. And this concept of a passion for activity was, this scale with those 2 axes was introduced by Vallerand in 2003, and then Rosenberg and Krauss took it further and applied it to pornography use. And then, so Harold Rosenberg from Rosenberg and Krauss was Alan Davis's mentor and influence in their graduate work, and then Davis and Rosenberg together extended this model and looked into MDMA use and cannabis use through the lenses of passionate attachment. And I think, simply put, passionate attachment, it's like you're applying human-like attachment qualities or relationality towards substances or events. And the uniqueness of this cluster of themes is that they used attachment in both senses. They did mention, actual attachment measures in the Bowlebian sense, also attachment to humans. They used experience and close relationships scale to measure that. And they also use this novel scale to measure attachment to, cannabis and MDMA on these scales of obsessive attachment and harmonious attachment. Happy to unpack more sometime later. And I think the takeaways essentially, let me see this clicking issue. The takeaways are that the identified themes here reflect the kind of multidimensionality, how multidimensional and multidirectional the current emergent body of that attachment psychedelic research is. And I think they point at some promising directions. I am sure not every direction presented in this cluster of themes will be kind of expanded very soon in much detail, but I hope some of them will kind of take off and be elaborated on by either the original researchers or some new emerging researchers. I certainly see a lot of promise. And for our lens, the epistemology, almost again half and half. So bigger half was positivist epistemology, and the smaller half was constructivist, which is a lot with some other epistemologies thrown in. So I think we didn't expect that. I personally expected maybe more positivist. So it's a good thing for me personally that it's not just all positivist. And the prevalence of positivism, hold on, that's not quite there yet. The prevalence of positivism aligns with our understanding of how positivism was a very prevalent approach leading up to these publications, spanning from 2015 and 2024. And of course, we need to kind of push the boundaries and go beyond just purely rigid positivist approach. And further incorporation of attachment constructs into psychedelic research, we think can benefit both science, research, and clinical work. And we think that more attachment and psychedelic research is needed in more diverse populations, because most populations will not very diverse with more robust methodologies. Yeah, I think science would benefit from it, and it's important from the researchers and to understand our own positionality and how it factors into the work we do, and also to state our epistemologies, where we come from, what are our biases, why we're doing what we are doing. And I think with that, I conclude this presentation and we can go to discussion.
Thanks, Esenia, for the wonderful and information-packed presentation. There was a lot of interesting and relevant things going on. There's a couple of questions that I'll just pick. The first one about the attachment perspective. There's a question on I'm curious about the healing childhood traumas, particularly the wounded child in adulthood affects attachment orientation. Have you explored the use of psychedelics as a tool for processing, accepting, and healing these wounds? Personally, I identify with an avoidant, fearful attachment style, and through my own experiences with psychedelics, asked the person asking the question, I've noticed shifts in how I relate to both my mother and father. This, in turn, seems to influence how I attach to romantic partners. Could you elaborate on how psychedelic experiences might impact attachment patterns and relational dynamics?
It's always a good question. It's a very good question. It's always a good question to what degree psychedelic researchers should they or can they disclose their own experiences, right? And so let's try and provide a balanced answer here. So my understanding, at least from the literature, right, so far is that from both literature on attachment and psychedelics, that that rewiring or rewriting of those scripts is possible. So without recommending anything, especially illegal, so please keep in mind your own country's context wherever you are. The findings do indicate that there is a possibility. Personally, I would say that I've experienced earned secure attachment, but it was in the context of kind of like Buddhist counseling work rather than psychedelic specific work, or just like plain psychotherapy. So it was kind of like, I suppose, an integration of spiritual and psychotherapeutic work. I also think it's the work that requires, it's not necessarily just like one-off. So like even if you find an aligned therapist, a counselor, or even legal psychedelic practitioner, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's one-off. It might require some maintenance later, even if you witness maybe changes immediately after and maybe they're sustained. It doesn't mean necessarily they will be sustained for the entire life. So I don't know if that helps to answer this question, and I don't know if it helps the person who asked, but from what I see, there is a lot of promise. And from what I see, even if attachment changes or attenuation of attachment security are not in explicit goals of psychedelic-assisted therapy, in the literature I viewed, in the kind of like trainings I've done in psychedelic-assisted therapy, the case videos of participants undergoing, participating in big MAPS and like sponsored clinical trials, attachment changes may happen and do happen even if it was not discussed explicitly as a goal or endpoint of the study. And I think both peer-reviewed wise, there is some literature, and I think there is perhaps anecdotal people's experiences sharing about doing this work. I hope this helps.
Yeah. Thanks. And my follow-up kind of question or comment on this would be: do you think this might be related to somehow to this idea of critical periods, and maybe psychedelics opening up kind of again some of those critical periods? And I guess that idea that some social or psychological developments take place specifically in specific age periods, and after that they're kind of closed. And then there's the idea that maybe psychedelics, one of the mechanisms by which psychedelics might help mental health and well-being might be that they are able to sort of open up again those critical periods of childhood, adolescence, and so on, in which people could then maybe modify something or learn something new. And I guess that would fit the attachment approach quite well. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for unpacking that, Marcus. I'm because I wasn't sure what's kind of like the level of knowledge in the audience. So I didn't go into critical periods in detail. But whenever I mentioned neuroplasticity related to psychedelic effects, is what I meant. Yes, in at least the few articles discussed today, that was the researchers either understanding based on the empirical studies or theorizing regarding how this might work. Exactly what you said, that during psychedelic effects and critical periods reopening, that neuroplasticity in the acute effects itself and after for a limited period of time allows to revisit those memories, those experiences, and process and integrate them, and hopefully rewrite, so to speak, the attachment scripts, so people can move forward, hopefully with more secure attachment. And again, I also think that's, I think, anecdotal and just the intuition I have, that those processes often happen even without being explicitly brought and verbalized into the process. But perhaps having kind of structured intention to do that and discussing it in advance perhaps helps. So 100%.
Great, thanks. And there's another question from the audience about your study, asking, in the ayahuasca context, why do you think there was no relationship between childhood trauma and post-traumatic growth, or between more challenging experiences and post-traumatic growth? And how does this relate to how childhood trauma predicts outcomes with other forms of intervention, as mentioned in your paper? So what's going on with the absence of those associations with childhood trauma and challenging experience?
That's a really good question. I think that's what all of us have been asking ourselves when we got results, because the literature on the topics, albeit limited, did indicate the kind of higher level of challenges in this cohort with higher trauma exposure. So we were surprised, and even though it's not a small sample size. It's, I think, 140 to 180 people who participate in those surveys. So it's not something one could easily dismiss. So yeah, I think we're still perplexed, and I think our understanding is that more research is needed, and which is one of the reasons kind of like I'm continuing this work. I think maybe re-traumatization is one of the potential factors here. Another thing, we didn't look into integration. It's possible that there was difference between people who had proper integration, people who didn't, but as those were mixed together, that did not transpire. So I think these are two of our main hypothesis at this point, but as a researcher, I kind of don't want to hypothesize. I just want to do more research and hopefully find that out. And also, I think some of the interesting differences were like among demographic characteristics in that paper, where such as that I think younger, let me get this right, younger and more wealthy participants reported lower post-traumatic growth, which I think kind of like maps up onto like that with maturation, people tend to kind of like have more of all sorts of kind of like things resolved and arrive into a more grounded place. And I think one more correlation was that people who were currently in psychotherapy at the point of taking that survey also seem to have less post-traumatic growth, which kind of, again, this, I think, corroborates potentially the re-traumatization hypothesis, because if they were essentially still in psychotherapy, which means they needed psychotherapy, which means they experience some sort of distress. So, okay, so maybe completely speculative and theorizing, maybe they, adverse and challenging experiences were not properly addressed, not properly integrated. They're still dealing with them while they're taking our survey. And this could have happened in the context of re-traumatization when whether the therapists were not properly trained, or maybe a person didn't think about attachment events, or maybe even the setting itself was perhaps underground without certain things in place that could facilitate that structured support. These are some of the thoughts I have.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I guess it might go also to show that some of the assumptions that we have about childhood traumas and post-traumatic growth might not hold up. So we might have, and people might have kind of assumptions that might not turn out to be empirically true. And I guess that goes also to relates to these kind of risk factors that people often assume to be related to psychedelic use.
Yes, that's a really good point. And I think one of our, again, theoretical understandings and conclusions based on that data was that if people with high level of trauma not worse off than the rest of the cohort, which means, and we know how trauma is notoriously hard to feel, hard to treat, how kind of like typical gold standards are not so efficient, then hey, maybe psychedelic informed treatments and psychedelic assisted treatments are maybe better than what we have currently, because if they help everyone equally, so to speak, those with more trauma and those not, then maybe that's the answer.
Yeah, good. Then there's a question about the person asking this is saying that I happened to talk last week with evolution psychology PhD researcher about attachment theory, and her view is that there's no real empirical evidence for it. Could you talk about the situation of empirical evidence for or against attachment theory? Is there empirical evidence for attachment theory? Is there evidence against attachment theory?
That's a really good question. However, I'm not an evolution psychologist, so I cannot claim anything in that field or from that viewpoint. I wasn't trained in that. I was trained in psychology and substance abuse counseling, and currently my PhD in social work. So these are domains I'm speaking through and the lenses. But what comes to mind to me that this people seem to get. People seem, to take sides and get divisive based on different criteria and different, categories and topics. And this might or might not, like that's just our nature as humans. And this might or might not be the case. But at the top of my head, I can recall, in my opinion, very stunning and good example of that from Harlow with the famous monkey experiment and the monkeys who were. So they were monkeys who were assigned to like a wire mother, fake mother, or wire mother, but that was not cozy and comforting, but had a milk bottle, and the mother was like a kind of not a puppet, but almost like a statue, or maybe mannequin. And monkeys who were assigned to a mother with like soft, cozy coverage, but didn't have a bottle. And since the understanding originally, even Bowlby's early understanding was that attachment is purely survival. It's purely evolutionary survival, and that's all to it. And towards the end of his life, he changed those views. Monkeys tend to choose the comforting, cozy mother, even though she didn't have the milk bottle, versus the wire mother with the milk bottle. Very interesting experiment. Please look it up if you're interested. Indicating that it wasn't pure survival and hunger that was behind seeking that proximity, but more of nurture, connection, and associated phenomena. That's a really important part in that type of research. And the visuals are very stunning. And so I haven't looked into empirical evidence against attachment theory because I haven't happened to do that. Because in my I suppose in my research and in my lived experience, it checks out, and it has checked out for many people and many researchers. So I just haven't had a need to do that. I don't know if that helps, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I could add that in my understanding, the kind of one of the issues of disagreement maybe there is that attachment theory, which is of course John Bowlby was heavily influenced by evolutionary theory, and so he kind of thought that his theory is strongly evolutionary based. But from a modern perspective, the difference might be that attachment theorists often draw quite a direct link from childhood experiences with the father and the mother, and those experiences sort of form the template of social relationships in later life. Whereas evolutionary psychologists are saying often that, well, you have your relationship with your mother and father, but surely that will be different for your let's say friends in adolescence or adulthood, or your romantic partner or collaborators and tribe and so on. So they are emphasizing the kind of differences in the nature of those social relationships. So I guess everyone agrees on
The early
people being attached differently to different people, but whether it's something that carries from your childhood, the template really carries forward to your adulthood. I don't think there's too many studies, actually, that long studies, sort of tracking measuring attachment in childhood and then tracking people to their let's say 30s or so, so I guess that might be one of those kind of.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful context. Yeah, and thank you for providing that, Marcus. Yeah, again, like you said, if there is not enough empirical research, then maybe we should do empirical. Maybe like we have a lot of people here, from my understanding, maybe someone would be willing to take this on, and I'm happy to collaborate. I think my contacts, Henry and Marcus have my contacts, so you can look me up. I'm open to collaboration, and feel free to contact with any questions anyway. So yes, maybe someone is, ought to research that on one hand. On the other hand, I think maybe people asking these questions just don't have lived experience that would corroborate this. So that's understandable, because I think the lived experience of people with secure attachment is very different from lived experience of anyone with one of the three insecure attachment types. So that would make sense, because if those concepts don't resonate with their lived experience, and most people are securely attached, statistically speaking, that would make all these constructions seem very strange and not kind of like resounding with one's life and one's observations, which then can inform how we approach research too. So I think there's a lot of different layers here to unpack, but I think one takeaway from this could be that more empirical research is needed, and then we can meet and discuss the empirical research.
Excellent, thank you. It's already 8 o'clock, and I think we don't want to take too much of your time, and
it's up to you. It's up to you. I'm happy to discuss the last 3 questions from what I see, but it's up to you two as the hosts and the organizers. Completely up to you. I have a couple more minutes. I can't stay for much longer. You let me know.
Okay, we could have a look at this. A couple of short questions. What is the hypothesis, your opinion, for the reason behind attachment anxiety correlation with mystical experiences?
Really good question. Appreciate it. Thank you. So I think again it's a combination research, then meditation, Buddhism, neuroscience, and psychology, and lived experiences, is that I think we briefly touched upon this, but perhaps too briefly, that attachment anxiety, or more widely speaking, attachment insecurity, creates that sort of absence of secure attachment quite naturally, right? If it's not there, if it hasn't been installed in the early age. And I think that may mean that the person has maybe higher openness as a trait. I actually haven't looked into this. That's a really good question. Because inadvertently, completely speculative, do not quote me, just thinking out loud. Inadvertently, they're always on the lookout for something or someone that can help fill that vacuum. It could be a big idea, it could be important job, it could be affiliation with someone or something that feels bigger than oneself. Like to get it filled in any way possible, including relationally. And as we know, people with anxiety or anxious attachment tend to kind of like click with people with avoidant attachment because psychologically they're like ideal for each other, because one is always chasing and one is always running, and then they shift and then they do it again. So I think this could be underlying one of the underlying mechanism, and some of the literature we discussed today points at that people with anxious or overall insecure attachment tend to have higher propensity through absorption, through dissociation, for mystical experiences, which then ends up, of course, beneficial, statistically speaking, or empirically speaking, because mystical experiences we know are associated with higher beneficial therapeutic outcomes. So I would recommend looking at Per Granqvist's literature. I think it was something else, but maybe I'll send it later. I can't think of what it was right now, but two researchers came to mind. One of them is Per Granqvist.
Okay, very good. Maybe we'll take briefly as the final question, just one more question. What are some traditional styles of healing attachment styles? So
that's a really good question. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm unfortunately, I don't know if there is a body of literature on that. I know there is a lot of self-help literature when it comes to dealing with attachment in romantic relationships, but that's not the literature research I am conducting, or I am sort of the focus of my work. But earned attachment security is a big topic in this realm, and I can think of the author. There is like a big volume I can share later with Marcus and Henry, and I could circulate if that's of interest. It's essentially like a manual on how to rewire attachment style that was published, I want to say, at least 10, 20 years ago. So maybe there is something else in that domain. But you can, and I think I have looked up, and it's a thing, like you can look up something like therapist who is attachment informed, or therapist who specializes in earned secure attachment, which doesn't, if they say that, doesn't mean they're actually good at it. So it's as always trial and error, but it's definitely a direction in psychotherapy work, relationally oriented psychotherapy work, except it's not as prominent as I wish it was, which is, again, one of the reasons why I am working in attachment, because I feel like it should be household knowledge, household basics of how we interact, whether with infants or otherwise, and hopefully everyone would benefit from that.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess modern psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy doesn't necessarily talk about the attachment styles as such, but I guess much of psychodynamic psychotherapy is directed towards the assumptions of kind of repairing some of those early relationships and interaction patterns in the spirit of attachment theory.
So did you say that you think some of psychotherapy is focused on that, you think? Is that what you said?
I think they're not necessarily focused, or they don't necessarily take it as a sort of an explicit focus, but they are addressing some of the same themes.
Yeah, I think it highly depends on the modality on each practitioner, because it's, of course, a heterogeneity of modalities. And for example, here we have, I mean, I don't think it's specific to the US, but it's, for example, cognitive approaches, cognitive behavioral approaches are very popular, and even with practitioners and researchers claiming that cognitive behavior approach is ideal for psychedelic work, for example. And I think truly to each his own, because personally, I question the ability of cognitive behavioral approaches to get to something as profound, as kind of like all-encompassing in terms of implications for the rest of one's life in many lives domains, when it comes to attachment trauma. So I personally think different approaches, more psychodynamic approaches are in order, but that's me.
That's what I also think, that the psychodynamic and psychoanalytic approaches, they are the ones that sort of have this theme on their list more explicitly than, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy. So, okay, excellent. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. This was really wonderful and really interesting and informative.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate all the thoughtful questions, your attention span. It's not a short event. Great questions. Sorry we didn't address all of them, but I feel like we addressed most. And the 3 different topics we couldn't touch upon, but I think 2 different topics are very intriguing, is genetic underpinnings of the attachment theory and cultural critique of the attachment theory. Hope we can do it some other time, some other circumstances. But very favorites of mine. Unfortunately, we couldn't go into this today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Esenia, and thanks for all the participants and all the questions that you asked us as well. Thanks.
Thanks.
And bye.